You want to finish what you started? You came to the right place. Them girls that you came with, you might have to part with. Depending on how this thing shakes. Wauwatosa, Kenosha, Economo is in the house.
Okay, welcome to another episode of the New Look podcast, where we're going to be taking a new look at cyber primarily, but a lot of things. And very lucky to be joined by a man who has probably had more influence on thinking about the cyber domain, both in the private and public sector, than anyone I can think about in the last few years. Dmitri Alperovitch, thanks for joining us, my friend.
Thanks for having me.
I like judging what people have in their background initially. Not that I've taken time to organize mine, but
I did get an 8 out of 10 on Room Raider. So
is that right?
I did. Yeah.
Wow. Well, you got Raven Rock, which is a great book.
Yeah.
All sorts of cool coins.
Yeah. Where's your challenge coin collections?
I have no challenge. I mean, I have them somewhere from when I was in the military, but this is an ongoing debate. With my staff wants me to like get congressman challenge coins, but you have to pay a lot of money for them, and it seems like a horrible waste of office money. So I have none of my own challenge coins. So sometimes I see veterans in my district and they're very disappointed that I don't have a coin to give them. But what are you gonna do? Okay, Dmitri, who are you? Where are you from? Where does this story begin?
Well, I guess the very beginning begins in Russia. I was born in Moscow back in the Soviet Union days, and immigrated when I was a kid with my parents, and ended up in Chattanooga, Tennessee.
How old were you when you immigrated?
I was 13, and went to Chattanooga in high school there, and then ended up at Georgia Tech, where I pursued what ended up being the first degree that they ever gave in what at the time was called information security. Now, of course, we call it cybersecurity. And that was sort of the beginning of my career in this field over 20 years ago.
Wow. Wait, so why did your parents leave Russia? Why how did you wind up in Tennessee? Why Chattanooga? I've been to Chattanooga. I used to work for a member of Congress from Chattanooga. Yeah. So I have some love for Tennessee. But how did that happen?
So my dad was a nuclear physicist in Russia, working not on nuclear weapons, but on civilian nuclear reactors. And just by sheer luck, he wasn't sent to Chernobyl. A lot of his colleagues were. Some of them came back with cancer and subsequently passed away within months of coming back. And since then, sort of my parents decided that this regime was, at the time, the Soviet Union regime was not great to live in, and we need to get out of there. Of course, to legally immigrate took a long time, so we didn't actually end up leaving till the Soviet Union fell apart. But he got a job at TVA, Tennessee Valley Authority. He wasn't doing nuclear work anymore because, as you know, the nuclear industry in the United States has kind of gone belly up. But he was still kind of working on energy stuff, and that's how we ended up in Chattanooga. I'll tell you this, I thought I knew English before I got to Chattanooga, and my first day in school, I'm like, holy crap, I don't understand anyone here. So it was an interesting experience learning Southern.
That's funny. So obviously your parents left the Soviet Union because they were troubled about the direction of the country, but do you as a child growing up in Moscow since you were 13, do you have fond memories of the city? I mean, I've never been. I mean, put aside sort of the political management of the country? I mean, what do people need to know about Moscow as a city? And as you respond, I'm going to change my cameras because I'm noticing a delay on this one. So don't be freaked out by that. This is a very technically savvy podcast.
Yeah. So I have not been back to Russia since I left in the early 90s. And certainly from what I've seen, Moscow has changed a lot. The Moscow that I remember growing up there in the 80s was a very beautiful old city, 800 years old, with a lot of great old architecture. I think a lot of that has changed because they've been building skyscrapers, casinos, and neon signs. So a lot of Moscow, from what I've seen now, looks like Las Vegas, which I think is a shame because that was not the character of the city that I knew and grew up in. So the Moscow that I remember is long gone.
Do you still have an affinity for Russian literature, Russian movies? Do you maintain a cultural connection to the motherland?
Not the present day Russia, but certainly the old classical literature, Tolstoy, Dostoevsky, absolutely. And one day I want to teach my kids about that history and the rich culture that Russia has.
Are you teaching them Russian?
I'm trying. Really hard. My wife doesn't speak, and it's hard to keep that in a household where only one parent is able to speak.
Okay, so you go to Georgia Institute of Technology for undergrad. When did you kind of know that you had a facility for information security and cyber? Where did that sort of intellectual interest and ability begin?
Well, I'll tell you, it's an interesting story because when my dad got a job at TVA, he was doing interesting work in terms of energy distribution and how to, this was in the era of deregulation, and you can transfer power from one state to another much more easily. So he was working on efficient ways to transfer power and get it to regions that needed it at low prices. But that wasn't very intellectually satisfying to himself. So he started looking and just on the side learning about encryption, cryptography, just purely for the mathematical brilliance of it. I had a little bit more of an entrepreneurial streak, and I said, well, why don't we create a company out of this? So I was still in high school, and we started a company together, building encryption software. And it wasn't as huge of a success as CrowdStrike, but we did okay. And that sort of got me really fascinated by this field of cybersecurity, or at the time was called information security. And what I realized early on is that the encryption stuff was great, and you can design really fail-safe encryption technologies that would make the data secure, but all of that would be for naught if someone stole your keys that you would use to encrypt your data. So at the end of the day, the most important thing was understanding that this was at the ultimately a cat and mouse game. Someone's trying to break in and either steal valuable data, be that encryption keys or raw data, and it was all about how do you thwart these adversaries, and that's what really set me on a path of being in this industry.
What is the key skill set, though, that you need as a young student and entrepreneur to be good at cryptography? Is it a facility with math? Is it a ability to synthesize across different domains? What is it? Because to me, it's like I was a guy who was good at reading and writing, but I could never have done something like that.
So encryption is hardcore math, very advanced math these days, and it's not for the faint of heart.
So you were like a math whiz, is it fair to say? You were
well,
good
my dad was much more brilliant in that space, but I did okay.
Well, you're being modest. Okay, so did you go directly to grad school at Georgia or after undergrad?
I did. So I got my bachelor's in computer science with a focus on information security, and then just as I was graduating, they started a new program, a master's program in information security, and I was the first graduate out of that program.
And then what was your first job out of that program?
So it was interesting. My first job was a startup that was doing email security. And at the time, email security meant really encrypting data, making sure that large companies, Fortune 500 companies, wouldn't have someone intercepting their emails. And when I joined that company, this little thing called spam was just on the horizon. It was 2 to 3% of all email. It was really more of a nuisance. And I remember I was meeting with the CEO of the company. I said, what's your plan? What's your roadmap for the product? How to evolve it? And he said, well, more and more people are asking us about spam, how to deal with it. So we're going to spend the next quarter or two working on solution to that, and then we'll go back to encryption. And your job really is to figure out the spam thing. And needless to say, we started working on spam, and we never stopped because the spam traffic took off just like that. This was around 2003 when botnets just emerged. So these, for your viewers who don't know, these are machines, innocent machines, your grandma's machine that may have been infected, and becomes essentially falls under the control of a criminal, oftentimes in former republics of the Soviet Union. And they can use that machine to send out spam, to steal data from that machine, use it to launch denial of service attacks, essentially huge traffic.
Why is it always from a former Soviet satellite?
I'll tell you that in a second.
Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt your flow.
Yeah, no, but literally these botnets emerged and they started using them to send out spam. and spam went from 5% of all email traffic to 95% of all email traffic almost overnight. And that also led me realize that it was really, really important to understand your adversary. A lot of these guys that were doing, mostly guys that were doing these activities, were in the former Soviet Union. I, of course, understood Russian, so I was able to get into their forums that they used online to communicate about their latest techniques and trends, and use that intelligence to help build better protection for our company. And the reason, by the way, why a lot of them are in the former Soviet Union is actually pretty simple. It's not because that region has a monopoly on crime or cybercrime, but what it does have is ability for you to operate with great impunity. And what's been happening is that, of course, you had lots of criminals that were getting into this field in the 90s in the US and Europe and elsewhere, but they got arrested pretty quickly and learned their lesson. And you didn't survive fairly long in those countries, Western countries, if you were a cyber criminal. Law enforcement learned very quickly how to find you and ultimately prosecute you. But in Russia and Ukraine and other parts of the Soviet Union, that was not the case. Initially, law enforcement paid little attention to them, and then when they did start paying attention, it was really to give them a choice: go work for the government and moonlight as doing cybercrime on the side, or you'll be sent to Siberia. And as a result, you really have the same situation develop as you did back in Sicily in the 1800s, where lack of law enforcement created these powerful mafia structures that would, to this day, make it very, very difficult to dislodge. Now you have the same thing essentially happening in the Soviet Union in these organized cyber criminal gangs.
Do the cyber criminal gangs have like an operational relationship with actual old school criminal gangs, or are they just kind of doing their own thing?
There's some connections. The old school gangs, the ones that are doing your typical, prostitution and drug trafficking and the like, realize that there's money to be made in cyber. So there is some links between the two, but usually the people that are going into cybercrime are more technically minded. They may not be able to go beat up someone and ask for protection money, but they're able to do a lot of great damage online.
Okay, so you're at this company, you're working on the spam problem, you're infiltrating, Russian chat rooms and all sorts of things. When does CrowdStrike enter the picture, or when does the idea for CrowdStrike enter your head?
So by the way, the interesting thing about me learning this early on, that attribution is super important. Actually understanding who is responsible for these things can give you intelligence to understand what they may be doing and sort of stay a step ahead of the game, which was really critical once we get to CrowdStrike. But that company, CipherTrust, we got acquired a few times and ended up at a company called McAfee, which was one of the largest cybersecurity companies at the time. And I was running all of global threat research operations at that company. And in 2010, I get a call from this other little company called Google that tells me that they tell me that they've been hacked. And we started looking into it. We realized there were many other companies that were hacked, and oh my God, it's actually coming from China. And it wasn't actually cybercrime. It looked like it was government sponsored. They were working to get access to Gmail accounts of dissidents in Tibet and others that would be a major threat to the Chinese regime. And it was the first wake-up call for me personally, as well as the broader industry, that you're not just dealing with some cyber criminal that's trying to send out spam or steal your credit card. Now you're dealing with military and intelligence services of global powers like China that are breaking into corporate networks to steal intellectual property, to access sensitive data in support of their regime's gains. And to address that threat, you needed a completely different mentality. The things you were doing to stop, a teenager in a basement somewhere would not work against, the PLA, the People's Liberation Army, that has tens of thousands of people, billions of dollars in budgets, very, very different threat actor. And that really gave me the idea that we need to do something very different in response to the threat, and led us ultimately to start CrowdStrike.
Sorry, I muted myself. After I've been spending the last few months making fun of my older colleagues for not knowing how to unmute and unmute themselves.
Jeff Bezos had that issue in his recent testimony. If you're
I didn't see that part of it. Oh my gosh. I just can't imagine you watching these congressional testimonies on tech issues, just shaking your head at home. We'll come back to that. So what was the core niche of CrowdStrike, or what was the sort of demand in the industry you were responding to?
So it really was a realization that no one was addressing this nation state threat, that all these companies were getting hacked. I actually coined the phrase that many people have repeated since then, that there are only two types of companies: those that know that they've been hacked and those that don't yet know, but they've all been hacked. The demand was there, and no one was really addressing this threat from a perspective of, let's build some unique technology, let's use intelligence to understand who the threat actors are, let's provide services to help companies rebuild and investigate these breaches. So that was the idea behind CrowdStrike that we started in 2011 and ultimately built into what is now the largest cybersecurity company on the planet.
No big deal. But at the time, I mean, I would imagine you had a sense, because you were really hardcore in the industry since at least 2003. You've been studying it your whole life. You had to have a sense that you were at the start, even back in 2003, of something huge, right? That you were, you're like 2 decades ahead of the curve. Now everybody has at least an awareness that cybersecurity is important. But what was that must have been a pretty exciting feeling at the time.
It was. I knew that this was going to be a big industry, but at the time, no one was even thinking about nation states. It was all about, how do you stop the criminal actors? How do you stop the hackers that hack into your website and deface it and put up some stupid message on it? And it was a big enough problem that we knew that there was a lot of money to be made here, that there was a great cause in helping to protect companies and other organizations, governments from these types of attacks. It took on a totally different meaning, though, when we started CrowdStrike, because now it felt like you were defending democracy itself from the Chinese Communist Party, from the Russians, from the Iranians, the North Koreans, all the folks that are trying to do our nation harm. And that was a much bigger cause than just defending against some criminals.
Out of curiosity, and I want to tie this to something I hope we talk about later, in the early stages of CrowdStrike, I mean, you're taking this massive risk, leaving the Death Star of McAfee and starting your own rebel alliance. So that's a risk. But what were your interactions with the federal government as you tried to put this company together? Was the government ever one of your clients? Did you get any funding from a DARPA-like entity?
We didn't. I mean, we were fortunate enough that we were able to raise $25 million literally off a PowerPoint deck. We made 25 slides, so it was about $1 million per slide. The joke was that we should have made more slides. But we didn't need government funding. We actually didn't have many government contracts initially, and we actually stayed away from that because, as you well know, dealing with the government is so hard. It takes forever, and the thing that's always frustrating for me with the government is that in the commercial sector, you know who's in charge. The one person that will tell you yes or no. In the government, there's 1 million people that can say no, and it's really hard to find the person that actually can say yes. So we didn't start really looking at the government business until it was much later, and we actually could afford to spend 2 years working on a single contract. When you're a startup, you can't take necessarily those risks, and it's much easier to work in the commercial space. But just in having, I've had connections with government officials going back to the Bush administration and then later as well. Great people like General Alexander, who was running NSA at the time. They, in the classified space, I had a security clearance. They were telling me what they were seeing, and I was sharing with them what I was seeing in the unclassified space. And what was always frustrating to me is that the government knew what China was doing, that they were hacking into all these companies, and they knew it for many years. But it was all classified. No one would mention the words China and cyber within the same sentence. And I was really the first one that started publicizing what I was seeing in the unclassified world, just working with our clients and doing attribution on what was taking place. And it was frustrating to me that the government for years would not acknowledge that this was going on. I remember, I think it was James Carney, the press secretary at the time, was literally asked after one of my reports at the White House podium to comment on it. How come, Dmitri here is writing reports on what China is doing and hacking into all these industries, and the government has no response, and he didn't have a comment. And at the time, the thinking in the government was, oh my God, if we just tell the world that we know that China's hacking, we'll lose our sources and methods. That was, of course, nonsense, and ultimately they got over it. And now the policy under the Trump administration, which I think is absolutely correct, is to do attribution, to do it rapidly, to do it with confidence, to do it with allies. And we're not losing sources and methods. We're still able to do it very effectively, and that was ultimately the right decision.
That's a great transition to maybe help my constituents in Northeast Wisconsin, a lot of whom, by the way, are getting hacked and are victims of ransomware. Maybe help them understand the broader threat landscape. And maybe we'll go from sort of what you view as the biggest threat, which I assume is China, and then kind of take us on a little tour through the rest of the threat landscape. And as we talk about China, what would be helpful, and I struggle with this in a lot of what I do, is just to connect the China threat to the concerns of kind of everyday Americans and people in Northeast Wisconsin, and why we should all care about this stuff.
Absolutely. So, broader picture, there are three types of adversaries that we face in cyberspace. You have the nation states, and that actually has not changed in the last 20 years. The folks that people cared about 20 years ago, Russia, China, Iran, North Korea, still the same problem set that we care about today. And my prediction is will be the same problem set we'll care about 10 years from now. The reality is that there are lots of nation states that have cyber capability, but I just don't go to bed worrying at night about what Singapore may do to the United States for very obvious reasons. As an ally, they wouldn't have interest in doing so. So there is an absolutely nexus between geopolitical struggles that we face with these four countries that now spill over into the cyber domain. But they operate very, very differently. China, I would argue, is the long-term threat, and they're using cyber, of course, to achieve global dominance, become a great power by stealing intellectual property across literally every single industry that we have, both technology, agriculture, industrial, manufacturing, you name it. And they're giving it to their domestic sector to help them bypass years and billions of dollars in R&D, so that they can manufacture it cheaper and then go out into the world and undercut us on price. And you now see them establishing national champions like Huawei that have grown to be massive behemoths and eclipsing anything in their particular space that Western companies are able to do. In fact, driving American companies out of that sector altogether. And we're now seeing that in other places like solar panels, for example. Lots of solar manufacturers in this country have gone out of business because the Chinese have stolen their intellectual property and then undercut us on price and made it impossible for us to do business. Unfortunately, we're seeing that in more and more industries. And unless we address it now, which I know we're trying to do with a 301 regulation that the U.S. Trade Representative put out, which resulted in tariffs, and I know are painful to lots of folks, including in the Midwest. But really, they're I believe, a necessary mechanism to make China pay for these activities, and hopefully at the end of the day convince them that this is not worth it. Russia, of course, we know is engaged in all kinds of muckraking in terms of trying to influence elections around the world. They do a little bit of economic espionage in cyber, but it's limited really to their oil industry and their financial sector. Particularly since the sanctions that were put in place in 2014. So they don't have the wide spread of domestic industry that could really leverage that intellectual property, so they're not doing a whole lot of it. And then the Iranians are doing all kinds of destructive attacks. They really pioneered those originally in their region against Saudi Arabia, and then later expanding it to the United States as well. And they view cyber as an asymmetric tool that, should we get into hot conflict with them, they want to use cyber to try to hurt us and our industry and achieve as much impact as possible, because obviously they can't reach us easily through kinetic means. And North Korea, very similar, but they're also, in addition to that, using cyber to finance the regime. So obviously we have very strong sanctions put on the North Koreans because of the nuclear and missile program, and they're using cybercrime. They're actually breaking into banks, stealing money. They're breaking into cryptocurrency exchanges, stealing cryptocurrency to finance the regime In a lot of ways, they're laundering it through banks in Macau and other parts of China in order to make sure that the regime has funds to continue building their nuclear program. So that's the nation state threat. Then we've talked about the cyber criminals that are still out there and trying to monetize their cyber operations. And then you have hacktivists, people that have an ideological motivation to conduct attacks. Mostly they're doing things like breaking into companies and stealing their email archives and dumping it for the world to see, or defacing websites. But now increasingly you have terrorists, groups like ISIS and Al-Qaeda that have used both cybercrime to finance their terrorist activities, Al-Qaeda in particular, but as we've seen with ISIS, using it very effectively to spread their gruesome videos and also doing hacks to identify individuals that they may want to target and use it for counterintelligence purposes. So increasingly, terrorist groups are becoming very sophisticated at this.
So we won't have time to dig into each of those threats specifically. So I'd like to just go deep on China, if that's okay. And as a starting point, I mean, how do you think the United States stacks up presently against China in cyber? What are our own strengths and weaknesses, or even our understanding of the Chinese cyber threat?
So if you were to rank our capabilities, and not just against China, but Russia, Iran, and North Korea, we're head and shoulders above them. The capabilities that the NSA has, the CIA, the Cyber Command, are just the best out there. And people, taxpayers should be proud of the capabilities that we've developed. But here's the issue. We don't use them except in very rare circumstances. So when you look at China, they may be sloppy, they may not be super sophisticated in a lot of their operations, but they do them and they achieve effects. And we are constraining ourselves and sitting back and saying, well, cyber is this tool that we never want to use unless, it's in some ways people are thinking about it as almost a nuclear weapon, which I don't think it is. It's certainly not in terms of effects that it can achieve. And for a long time, it required literally White House approval to conduct any major cyber operation with effects. Of course, as you can imagine, bureaucracies like that don't make it easy to conduct the operation. So what was most ridiculous to me at the time was that it was literally easier for us to conduct drone strikes in Syria, let's say, and kill people than it was to launch a cyber attack against their computers. Makes zero sense. The Trump administration a couple of years ago relaxed a lot of those rules, so the rules of engagements have gotten a lot better. I think there's more work that can be done there. But we need to fundamentally ask ourselves, we're sitting on all this great capability, why are we not using it to actually achieve some deterrence and impact adversaries?
I think even with the changes that we made in a couple NDAAs ago, making cyber surveillance and reconnaissance of persistent military activity, NSPM 13 and things like that, you still think, so the rules of engagement have gotten a little bit better, devolved to lower levels, but it's still not fast enough that, with the speed and agility, to use your phrase that you've imbued in my head for time immemorial, that you need to actually restore some semblance of deterrence in cyber.
That's right. That's one problem. The other problem is actually more structural. So currently we still have Cyber Command, as you know, and NSA under one roof, under General Nakasone, operating both of them. And I think it made sense for a long time to keep them together, because when Cyber Command was stood up about 10 years ago, it was too immature to act on its own and it needed support of NSA. I think the time has come to decouple those. And the big issue I see today is that by having them together, there is a tremendous amount of tension between the two organizations, because NSA, of course, is out there trying to collect intelligence, and they don't want to introduce any effects into the networks that they're sitting on, because if they do so, they may get caught, they may get thrown out, and they'll stop collecting. Their job is to keep on listening. The job of Cyber Command is, of course, to inflict pain on the adversary. And those are in tremendous conflict with each other. It's the age-old, combat versus intelligence debate. And unfortunately, it constrains operations that Cyber Command is able to do. Obviously, if you go to General Nakasone, he can resolve it, but not everything can go to a four-star general for obvious reasons. And I think it's really overdue for us to decouple the two organizations.
Just while we're on the issue of decoupling, you talked a little bit about the Chinese Communist Party subsidizing their national champions in general, but Huawei in particular. What is your view on sort of the 5G debate? And I mean, I think it's caught up in this broader debate, which is heated up post-coronavirus, as to what extent do we need an industrial policy in the United States so that we have some form of selective technological decoupling from China?
So I believe that the work that the administration has done on Huawei should be really commended, because we absolutely should not be letting Huawei into our networks or the networks of our allies. And to me, this is not an issue with Huawei, the company. Obviously, there's a lot of concerns about what Huawei may be doing themselves. But fundamentally, if it's Huawei, if it's ZTE, or if it's ABC Corp, it doesn't matter. What matters is the country that that company is operating in, which is China. And the fact that any company in China will not be able to tell the government no if the government shows up on their doorstep and asks them for a favor. And that is the fundamental issue that we face with any company operating in China that is doing work in something as sensitive as telecommunications. The analogy I often use is we don't buy tanks or aircraft carriers from China, and we'll never will, hopefully, for very, very obvious reasons, that would not be a secure way to procure military equipment. So why would we buy the digital equivalents of that? So to me, the focus on Huawei, the company, is almost misguided, because it's China that's actually the problem. And the work, particularly in the last couple of months, has been really phenomenal, because by putting in place sanctions on Huawei's ability to procure semiconductor chips needed for their equipment, we've basically locked them out of major markets. The UK just reversed themselves. They were going to go and use Huawei equipment. Literally about a month ago, the Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, said, no, we're not going to do it. French just followed suit. We'll see what the Germans do. But now increasingly people are realizing that not only is it a security issue, but you may not be able to even procure equipment from Huawei, because without access to chips, they won't be able to ship you a box that actually works.
But we still, I feel like we confront this problem always in the 5G debate, where we've gotten really good on the defensive side, and our allies are coming around to our view. Well, the Aussies were ahead of us on it. Germans still kind of on the fence. But, when Prime Minister Johnson comes and says, well, okay, but what's the non-Huawei alternative from the West? And I get it, we have Nokia and Ericsson, but Huawei's it's like 5G in a box, right? I don't have to deal with 10 different companies, and our Western companies can't compete on price. So is there an offensive side to this game that you think we haven't been playing yet? I'm struggling with this myself.
Absolutely. You mentioned industrial policy. I like to think of it as industrial strategy. The private sector is really, really good at innovation. They should be enabled to do innovation, and the government, I believe, should mostly stay out of it. But in certain sectors, particularly when you have to do very basic research that's extremely expensive, that's the area where the government can actually facilitate the work with funding. If you think about the origins of our industrial policy after World War II, we wouldn't have a semiconductor industry today if it weren't for government funding. We wouldn't have GPS. We wouldn't have the internet that we're using to communicate today without government stepping in and providing funds that would spur up this industry. And I think that's really, really important to do that basic research. And once you've done it, once you've built the basic protocols that enable the internet, then you can let the private sector unleash itself and do all kinds of innovation and build applications on top of it. But in areas like semiconductors, in which we're starting to lose our edge, Intel, as you may have seen, is considering outsourcing their fab manufacturing to other countries, particularly Taiwan. That's unacceptable. For us to lose our ability to manufacture semiconductors would prevent us, from a national security perspective, from being able to enforce the types of sanctions that we just did on Huawei, as an example. So the CHIPS Act, that is a bipartisan effort in Congress, bicameral, is really great on that front. And then investments in things like AI, quantum computing, and the like is also really, really important. And the government spends a lot of money today. It's we pretend we don't have industrial policy. We do. It's just not really focused, and tons of money being spent, perhaps not on the most important things. And I want to commend you on your leadership with the Endless Frontiers Act that you sponsored, also bicameral and bipartisan. That's going a long way to supporting that with $100 billion in funding. I think we need more of that.
Well, I appreciate that. Certainly we kind of took a look at historically, while the federal government is spending a lot of money, our investment in R&D has gone down since the old Cold War. My own view is we're at the beginning of a new Cold War, as imperfect as that analogy is. But it's going to require some more investment than we're making right now. But I guess particularly in cyber, I mean, even all the money in the world kind of can't solve the human problem, right? Like, how much should we think about this as just in order to be successful in cyber, the federal government needs to harness the talent of the best and brightest, right? Like the 14-year-old Dmitri Alperovitch, in Tennessee today. I think there's been a lot of concern that with Google, Project Maven, that the private sector and the talent we need in the private sector is not willing to work with the federal government. What is the picture as you see it in terms of private sector talent and federal government cyber agencies?
Well, I'm not super concerned about it because for every Project Maven and Google decision, there's literally 1,000 others that exist that where companies are working closely with the federal government. You notice that Amazon, Microsoft have not backed away from their projects with DoD and others. And there's numerous companies in Silicon Valley that are working closely with the government on many fronts. So I think Google was an aberration in that respect, and we'll see what ultimately comes of it. I know they've recently hired a lot of people from the government that want to rebuild those relationships, and hopefully that will work out. So I do think that we can always improve our relationships with Silicon Valley. The biggest impediment to me is actually the encryption debate that's taking place right now. It's sort of I remember the crypto wars of the 90s when the Clinton administration at the time was trying to ban encryption, and the industry rose up and said, no, this will impede the progress of building a secure internet that can be used for e-commerce and all the wonderful things we have now. We sort of have the reemergence of that now with, I think, legitimate concerns that people are raising with regards to child pornography and pedophiles that are being able to use the internet to harm kids and terrorists using it for communications. But we need to find a balance between being able to use this technology for good and enabling law enforcement to use it to track down terrorists and pedophiles. And I don't think we found it yet.
Yeah. Well, we sort of briefly referenced the recent congressional hearings with big tech. And it's interesting. There seems to be a convergence on the far left and the far right of demonizing big tech. And I know it's an easy target, but, at the end of the day, we're going to need to have a productive relationship with these companies to have a chance of beating the commies. I wonder, do you have a view on some of these hot button debates, Section 230 and things like that? I mean, it's a tough thing to kind of come up with a perfect Goldilocks solution.
I mean, and the debate right now around TikTok, I think, makes it very, very clear that we are going to have big tech, whether people like it or not. The question is, do you want big tech in America or do you want big tech in China?
Yeah.
And in America, we can regulate them, and we should be pursuing some of these companies for monopolistic behavior when they violate the law. We should be regulating them, when they cross the line. But at the end of the day, I'd rather have American big companies than Chinese ones, because I guarantee you the Chinese ones that do the bidding of the Chinese Communist Party are going to be way more harmful to our democracy and the future of this republic.
Well, you were very helpful in terms of the future of our democracy when we were debating a lot of election security reforms within the Cyberspace Solarium Commission. You were one of our outside red team analysts, and you were helpful in pushing back on a lot of our initial drafts. Maybe talk about your overall view of election security and kind of how we can pursue a dual track of kind of top-down funding and bottom-up funding with some of the nonprofits that are in the space.
So I'll tell you, the election security is literally the hardest issue you can have in cybersecurity. And we, as cybersecurity experts, simply don't know how to make it safe without using paper. So the safest thing we can do, ironically, I say this as a tech guy, is not to use technology, but making sure that even if you're using a touchscreen machine to cast your ballot, there's a printout record in every precinct in every county that can be hand counted if need be to assure that we have the correct votes. That's the most important thing. A lot has been done thanks to your efforts and the Solarium Commission's efforts and congressional funding to ensure that most jurisdictions in the United States in this coming election cycle will have a paper record, either a ballot that gets filled out by hand or one that gets printed out from a machine and can be verified. However, there's still, unfortunately, 7 states that have precincts, or even in some cases statewide, do not have paper ballot records in the machines that they use. And that's really unacceptable. It's probably at this point too late to change that for 2020, but we should not have another election come 2022 where that is the case. So more work needs to be done there, specifically in those states. Wisconsin, I'm glad to say, is not one of those and is safe. However, there is other parts of the election ecosystem that are very vulnerable. The voting registration databases in particular, we have seen the Russians target them in 2016. They didn't modify them as far as we can tell, but they were able to access some of those databases. Imagine a ransomware attack the day before the election on some of those systems that can cause havoc at the polls on election day because people can't verify whether you're a registered voter or not. Those types of things concern me a great deal. And the challenge, of course, that we face in our constitutional system is that elections are conducted by states and municipalities, not by the federal government. So the federal government actually has very little control and influence over the way that things are being conducted. Congress can allocate funding, but beyond that, it's really hard to do more. CISA, which is a cybersecurity agency led by a great guy named Chris Krebs, is doing a lot to try to work with states on a volunteer basis to scan their systems, election systems, and try to make sure they're secure. But again, they don't have the authority to build that security in. A lot of these municipalities are their own constitutional officers. When I started digging into this problem in 2016 and since then, I was shocked because I assumed secretaries of state at least had power over elections, and I found out in many states that's not the case. Some local election officials that are own constitutional officer that can decide what they're going to do and whether they're going to listen to the Secretary of State. So it's such a complicated issue with a patchwork of laws throughout the country that makes it very, very difficult to make it safe.
Well, I think that's also the flaw in thinking you can just have the federal government provide billions of dollars earmarked for cybersecurity to the states, because it's almost entirely dependent on who the people are at the state level who are in charge of the issue, right? And as you lay out, some states are better than others.
Yeah, and frankly, the Congress has traditionally allocated money in a uniform fashion, that states get money allocated based on population numbers or what have you. And that's actually not the way we should be doing it, because it should be need-based. If you've got a state like Texas that has almost no paper ballot machines, well, they need to have money to make sure that we can replace those machines and have a safe election, whereas other states are already far ahead and don't need as much.
What do you think is the most plausible yet most troubling election meddling scenario? Is it a Russia or a China targeting that one swing district and creating disinformation? Is it just trolls on social media saying the polling site is closed? What
changing votes, I'm not extremely concerned about. I think it's really, really hard to do and do it at scale where it actually impacts things. What I'm most concerned about, and this doesn't even have to be a nation state, it can be a criminal group that launches a ransomware attack on some of those precincts where you don't have a paper record, and votes are actually lost, right? People go in, cast their votes, and they're gone. And imagine the chaos that will cause and the unrest potentially, particularly if the election is close enough where it can impact things. And by the way, we spent so much time focusing on the presidential election. I know it's important, but as you well know, there's congressional races, there's senatorial races, there's local races. So those races are actually a lot easier to influence than presidential races because the scale is much smaller. And I have a lot of concerns about that.
How about your school board, right? I mean, that affects every parent in your district. That election is incredibly important. But do you think with blockchain technology, we could ever get to a point? I think there's certain cities in Denver or like villages outside of Denver that are doing blockchain enabled mobile voting. Is there ever a point we could get to where it's secure enough?
No. I mean, maybe one day. We are not even close to that. And, folks that have looked at this in academia and in industry very, very closely have not found any proposals that gives them comfort that we can do this safely and anonymously. If you remove the secret ballot part of our elections, we can absolutely do it securely. But of course, that's a fundamental tenet of our democratic system. So to do it anonymously and securely, we don't know how to do it.
Well, there you have it. The tech whiz is calling for a low tech or non tech solution to election security. This is the Battlestar Galactica approach to election security. The nerds will get that reference.
You can't hack paper.
That's right. Not yet, at least. Just quickly on before we get into some more fun stuff at the end here. On basic cyber hygiene, right? If you were going to talk to every small business in Northeast Wisconsin or high schoolers who are putting out their whole lives online, do you have sort of a core set of just recommendations for basic cyber hygiene?
Yeah, I do. And it's three things that everyone should be doing. One, the best thing you can do for cybersecurity is also the cheapest. And that is to use what's known as a password manager program. There are a bunch of them that are free or cost maybe $10 or so. Everyone should have one, because what it enables you to do is to create a different password for every application or every website that you use. It'll be a randomly generated password that you don't have to remember at all. It will be saved in your password manager application. And the only thing you'll need to remember is the one key that unlocks the password manager. That's it. And that way, a lot of people are getting hacked, by the way, not because they don't have strong passwords, but because they reuse passwords. So they go in and they enter a password on one website, that website gets hacked, their password gets stolen, and then the criminals will try to log into your bank account and other sites where you use the same password. Don't do that. Use random passwords that are automatically generated by these programs. And that's literally one of the best and most cost-effective things you can do, either as an individual or as a business. Second, be paranoid. On the internet, even a dog can pretend to be a human, as the old joke goes. And if something looks too good to be true, an email that comes in from the Nigerian prince that wants to give you a lot of money if you just wire some to his bank account first, chances are it's not true. Well, actually, it's definitely not true. And don't click on attachments from people you don't know, or attachments that kind of look weird. That's a lot of the ways that businesses get compromised these days. And then when it comes to kids in particular, my advice to parents and teenagers is think hard about anything you post online, because once it's there forever, and you cannot do it. And I worry about the politicians that are growing up as little kids right now, and what the world is going to be like for them when they decide to run for Congress, like you did, in 30 years, and things that they wrote in 5th grade on Facebook or TikTok or some other platform is suddenly used as part of that campaign. It's unfair, but it will be out there. So to the extent that parents can limit their kids' access to these things and monitor closely what they post, I think that's super important.
I've got a great fix to this that I came up with the other day, because I've been going around to high schoolers in my district telling them to get offline, because the best thing I ever did was delete my Facebook account the second year Facebook existed, when I was a senior in high school, or right after college. Sorry. So I got like in the nick of time. My 20s don't exist online. I want to tie the voting age to your ability to request online amnesty. So at 18, you can decide to exercise your ability to vote, and you get everything you did prior to that online goes into a magic amnesty box that you're going to invent, Dmitri. But you could also delay it and vote at 25, and then everything goes into an amnesty box and disappears, or wait forever and do whatever you want online, but then you can't vote. So that's my half-baked idea.
Yeah, and it's a great idea. The only problem with it is that the Chinese are going to steal that amnesty box.
Oh, that's a good point. All right. Well, I'll have to evolve this a little bit more. Okay. So you're now out of CrowdStrike. What's the next project here. Tell us a little bit about what you're doing with Silverado and what you're trying to achieve.
Yeah, so I left CrowdStrike really to focus on nonprofit efforts, and I see it as sort of the next CrowdStrike. CrowdStrike obviously was a commercial endeavor where we focused on trying to solve some of these hard problems with technology and intelligence. Now I'm focusing on the third pillar, which is policy, where I think we need to make a lot more progress, and particularly when it comes to issues like great power competition, especially vis-a-vis China. I think that is the issue of the century. If we don't get it right, the world that our kids and grandkids will live in, we will not recognize and we will not like. So we need to focus on that. We need to focus on cybersecurity, as we've just talked about, and extend the great work that you have done with the Solarium Commission. International trade is another big area of focus for us, where we need to find ways that we can have free trade, but trade that is equitable. And the reality is that we talked mostly about China in the context of cyber, but the things that they've done in the trade arena have been atrocious as well. They've literally told our negotiators to their face that we will steal from your industries and you can sue us in WTO, and by the time that lawsuit will make its way to the end, your industry will be gone. They've literally blatantly acknowledged that. That is unacceptable, and we need to correct those policies and focus on economic and ecological security as well. So those are the things we want to work on with the Silverado Policy Accelerator that I started. And really the idea behind it is that there's a lot of great folks that have ideas in this town, a lot of think tanks, academics, Congress people, but few are working on implementation issues. And the idea is, we've talked about this in the past, when people from think tanks come to you, they have great ideas, but they're too high level to do anything with. So we want to focus on how do you actually get things done. If the idea is that government should do X, Y, and Z, well, what does that actually mean? Which agencies, do they have the authority? Do they have the budgets? Who else should be supporting them? Is it congressional action? Is it executive branch action? We want to take essentially a venture capitalist approach to ideas, where we want to invest into great ideas and take them to fruition where they can be implemented by government agencies.
Well, I think there's a huge gap that you could potentially fill with that, because, my observation, it's nothing against the think tanks. It's just this old model where they, they'll write a 50-page report on great power competition with a bunch of acronyms like GPC. And then like the recommendation section will be 2 pages, and it will all be, the federal government needs a comprehensive strategy for X, Y, Z. And it's just, there's not a lot of meat on the bones. And then the second mistake I think a lot of think tanks make is they think that just by virtue of the brilliance of the prose of the report, all of a sudden legislators are going to make it happen. And they misunderstand that to get anything done in Congress, you have to cobble together a weird coalition of people, and you have to repeatedly just run into a brick wall every day. And so
figure out the right incentives. One of the things that I'm passionate about, we talked a lot about it, and you had some great recommendations in the Solarium Commission about this, that we need to improve the security of the federal government. And I believe that means that we really need to centralize the security apparatus of the federal government, probably within CISA, the cybersecurity agency that already exists. And the reality is that most agencies out there, Bureau of Land Management, they will never be good at cyber, but they're doing some really important work. And we need to figure out how do we move towards that model. Now, we have to appreciate that it's hard to take existing authorities and budgets from agencies and give it to someone else. A lot of entrenched interest within the government and in Congress around that. But can we create incentives where perhaps an agency will voluntarily use the services provided by CISA in exchange for reduced regulations that they have to do around FISMA compliance and other things that they really hate doing? And you can create these incentives where they will say, you know what, I want to get rid of this headache. I'd rather outsource it to CISA and let them deal with it. Those are the types of things that we need to consider. Not just government should do X, Y, and Z, but how do you actually get it done practically and working around the different entrenched interests. But we want to work with you and others in Congress and the executive branch on a bipartisan basis, because a lot of these solutions are not partisan. All of us, I think, now in Congress appreciate that China is a major threat. We need to confront it. Everyone I know cares about cybersecurity. These are not super political issues, and I think we can find common ground, just as you did with Senator King when you chaired the Solarium Commission.
Yeah, it was funny. There were times at which King, who's an independent, and I'm the evil Republican hawk allegedly, would be making way more hawkish arguments than me, and I'd be like, wait, I thought I was supposed to be the Republican here. But I think you're onto something, and it is totally a bipartisan space. I just would add, if you can figure out how to improve the cybersecurity of members of Congress too, you would do the nation a big service. Because it is a weird thing where constitutionally every member of Congress, regardless of their ethical background, their personal background, gets a clearance when they become a member, and then they get cursory training at best on how to handle classified information. So it's a huge fist target, foreign intelligence surveillance threats that we, I think, are ignoring right now. So just add that to your issue set there, Dmitri. Okay, let's talk about some fun stuff with the 5 minutes we have left. Has there ever been a good movie about cyber threats? Or there was that Black Hat Michael Mann movie. I never saw that, actually.
Pretty awful. So
Really?
the ones that folks in the industry really love are actually the old 80s War Games movie, if you recall, with Matthew Broderick hacking into NORAD. That I know had a lot of influence on many people that have gone into great careers in cybersecurity. But I think this is something that we need to really fix. Hollywood does not have a good portrayal of cyber. They try to dramatize it too much, where it becomes just nonsensical. And real world, I actually think is incredibly interesting, and you could do a great drama on cyber that will be captivating to people, but we just haven't done it yet. And by the way, one of the shows that I really love, not just because I was born in Russia, but I just think is an incredible drama series called The Americans. I don't know if you've seen it, but it's about 80s period where you had these KGB officers that were here illegally and were doing espionage. But it was an incredibly accurate portrayal of espionage with tradecraft and how oftentimes it's a boring profession where you're sitting around doing nothing, and then suddenly there's moments of great exhilaration. And they made it into an incredibly interesting show, despite the fact that they kept this espionage piece very, very realistic and not sort of James Bond caricature. And I think you can do the same in cyber.
I wonder if some of Hollywood's reticence on this is not just ignorance about the nuances of cyber, but an unwillingness to anger China in some of the storylines. I don't know. Maybe that's unfair.
I just had a conversation with someone that actually he wrote an op-ed piece in the Foreign Affairs about this, that Hollywood is running out of villains. It's not just China. China is one of the biggest problems. They don't want to offend them because of the huge market that it has, but because of the things that both the Russians and the North Koreans and the Iranians have done in targeting networks, and North Korea famously hacking into so many pictures when they released that movie about the assassination of Kim Jong-un. Now, Hollywood producers do not want to offend any of these countries and do not want to have villains from those countries. It is quite incredible that we are censoring ourselves in Hollywood because we're afraid of China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea.
So instead, the villain just becomes America and just bash how terrible of a country this is constantly. Out of curiosity, did you watch their Chernobyl miniseries on HBO?
I did. It was an incredibly powerful miniseries. It actually took me a little while to get myself ready to watch it because of the personal connection that my family has had to it. But it was incredibly well done. There were some inaccuracies, but I thought overall they deserve an A on that.
Yeah, I thought it was one of the best things I've seen in a long time. Okay, when it comes to reading, I can't see everything on your shelf there, but do you have time for fiction, or are you all business, nonfiction all the time?
Mostly nonfiction. I'll recommend two books that have just come out recently. One is a great book by BBC journalist Gordon Carrera, The Russians Among Us, and it covers the Russian illegals that were arrested in 2010 and goes into incredible detail. He does a great job of talking to the FBI agents that followed those people for a decade plus, and the true damage that those people had done and the tradecraft that they used. Really fascinating book uncovering that operation. And then one that was just recently released, you see up there, Active Measures by a good friend of mine, Thomas Ridd, that covers the whole influence landscape that started in the early days of the Soviet Union, almost 100 years ago, and how the KGB at the time was using it to target the West all the way into modern times. And he has had access to the archives of Eastern European intelligence agencies that opened up after the fall of the Berlin Wall, and uncovers a lot of amazing operations. Highly recommend those books.
Great recommendations. Do you have a favorite book of all time, or a book that you like give to other people? That's a tough question. I hate that question. Sorry.
I haven't written my own yet, so stay tuned.
Got to get on that.
But maybe one day.
Well, just when Hollywood dramatizes your life story, then, you don't even need to write the book. You can just do some input on the script. Okay, so if people want to follow you, what you're doing with Silverado or what you're writing, what's the best way to do that?
Follow me on Twitter right now. Alperovitch is the Twitter handle, and more news on Silverado coming this fall, so stay tuned on that.
Okay, final question for you, Dmitri. Let's say you come to Green Bay, Wisconsin to visit me, and we are having a beer, and a young high school kid from Northeast Wisconsin comes up to you and says, Dmitri, I heard you on the New Look podcast. I really just admire your career. I want to pursue a career in cybersecurity, and also at the intersection of cybersecurity and policy. What advice would you have for that young Northeast Wisconsinite?
First of all, follow your passions and go work at a startup. That was the best experience I've ever had. It's hard when you join a big company to make your mark on it and to advance through the ranks. But in a startup where everyone is sort of a chief cook and bottle washer, you get to try lots of different things. And I've seen people that I've hired into junior positions become VPs within a couple of years. As the company grows. So that's some of the best ways that you can advance your career, or frankly, start your own company, and then you're in charge and running the show. Mark Zuckerberg did it in his 20s when he was dropping out of college. Bill Gates, same thing. So I don't advise dropping out of college, by the way. It's a great experience, and I think few people make it once they drop out of college, like Zuckerberg and Gates. But after college, I think it's a phenomenal way to start your life and learn a lot.
Great advice from a very smart man. Dmitri, thanks for taking some time. Really appreciate it, and look forward to seeing you again soon.
Thank you so much.
The dude